The United States has threatened Iran with what it called a decisive response if American interests are harmed in Iraq. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said his country will also respond to any attacks by Iran against U.S. allies. He blamed what he called Iran's proxies for a rocket attack at an Iraqi military base near Baghdad International Airport on Monday. Several Iraqi soldiers were wounded in the attack at the base that also housed a small number of American troops. Washington has blamed Tehran for similar incidents in the past few months. Iran denies conducting any military activity in Iraq. Iran says its presence is limited to an advisory mission aimed at bolstering Iraq's anti-terror campaign. Jason Unruhe is a political commentator joining us out of Ontario. Jason, welcome. What do you make of this Pompeo statement? Many would say that the United States, with its military presence in Iraq, is a major source of instability in the country.
Essentially, the United States feels that they're losing control of the country that they had invaded and murdered 1.5 million people to try to gain control of. They set up a puppet government there who has since been removed, and the actions of not only the Iraqi people, but the Iraqi government of the last several years has been to move away, or try to move away from U.S. control. Essentially, they don't want to be under the thumb of U.S. imperialism, and the remaining U.S. soldiers in the country, who are nothing more than a bane on the existence of the Iraqis, who continue to still carry out the occasional crime on them, etc., is a very sore spot for a lot of people that are just trying to live their lives. Now, the United States has been a very destabilizing force, and if you are a destabilizing force in someone's country long enough, they're going to retaliate against you, even if it is in a very minimal way, just like this. I mean, the United States is raging angry at a rocket attack against their base while they are the butchers that have murdered 1.5 million people inside of the country. Essentially, Iraq is moving away from U.S. influence and trying more allying with more anti-imperialist countries in the region like Iran. They have a shared interest in opposing Saudi and Israeli-led aggression, U.S. imperialist control, and they're working together. This is by no means some kind of conspiracy or some attempt to attack America, as they are alleging. Now, the United States is just claiming that Iran is behind this in order to put diplomatic pressure on the country, because this is what they have been doing since they unlawfully withdrew from the JCPOA agreement and repeatedly threatened Iran with military actions. But as we saw with the Millennium Challenge, the War Games exercise, the simulation that was carried out in 2002, it was clear that the United States could not actually defeat Iran in a war. And this is probably more so now with the enhanced missile technology that has come along since then. So the United States is trying to blame, is essentially trying to use their own actions, their own patterns of causing instability, the anger that people have in Iraq towards the United States, and trying to project that onto Iran in order to try to undermine the relationship between the two countries. The United States has not gotten the message that nobody wants to deal with them anymore. The countries that they have murdered and subjugated for more than a century have had enough of what they are doing, and that they are going to ally together whether the United States likes it or not. They know they can't afford another invasion of Iraq, not politically, not economically, or what have you. It's not something that could be done. So rather than just admit that they're losing influence inside the country, which they rightfully should, they've decided to turn the speech against Iran and try to blame them and try to allege some kind of conspiracy.
Now, many in Iraq are asking, what is the United States doing in the country in the first place? You've got a U.S. embassy in Baghdad, which is manned by some 10,000 American troops. I mean, that's unprecedented around the world. So Iraqis still feel that the United States is an occupying power. What is the U.S. military doing in Iraq?
Well, the U.S. is still inside of Iraq because they're losing influence. They have 10,000 people watching their embassy because they need 10,000 people watching their embassy because the Iraqi people, not even so much the government, but the everyday person who has to live under the devastating consequences of which the country has not yet even recovered from as a result of the U.S. war. I think it's very clear that this is all about the United States stealing the oil of the country. Even recently, Donald Trump even cut any kind of entire humanitarian pretext or even kind of the usual lies they use to give to justify imperialism by simply sending U.S. troops into Syria just straight for the oil fields. They didn't even give a lie to justify it. And I think that this is the same thing here, but they're being a little bit more diplomatic about it because they still have the entire history of the justification for invading Iraq on the basis of trying to get rid of weapons of mass destruction, which proved that did not exist. And once it was obvious that they did not exist, it became about defeating they alleged the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. When this whole thing from the beginning was never about the Iraqi people, was never about weapons of mass destruction. This was about stealing and plundering the country to begin with.
And finally, Jason, going back to the incident itself, no one has claimed responsibility. Iraqi forces there in Iraq, in the country, would say that should they conduct such an incident or should they conduct an attack on American troops, according to Iraqi commanders, they say they're not afraid or embarrassed to claim responsibility for such an attack. But in this case, no one's really claimed any responsibility. Similar incidents that we've seen in the past with these could be homemade rockets targeting targeting the Americans or targeting Baghdad. Who knows who's conducting the attacks? My question to you is, Iraqi forces, I don't believe, would be shy to say that they would be behind such an attack, but they haven't claimed responsibility.
It does seem very strange that nobody would take responsibility for this. If it were, any kind of known resistance group, they would very probably step forward and say it was them and take credit for what they've done. I think that this is going to require an investigation to find out who it is. I would not be surprised if this was not any kind of particularly organized group, if not a group of people who are, or possibly even a new burgeoning insurgency against the United States' continued occupation of the country. It's hard to make any estimations about what's going on when there's no information available at the time. However, the United States still feels that no information is all they need to blame Iran for the actions.
Could it possibly be a different power that is trying to stir some kind of tension in the region, considering the current unrest in the country?
I would not be surprised if that were the case, given the current political climate inside of Iraq. There very well could be interested parties that would take this as an opportunity to try to destabilize the system further. It could be the Islamic State, it could be Al Qaeda, it could be a previously unknown group. The fact is, this is a kind of throwing a match into a room filled with a lot of explosive powder. Somebody is clearly trying to set something off by doing so, and for all we know, it could even be a false flag attack, for all we know.
Right.
But we don't really have a lot of information. But it seems very likely there could be someone who's trying to deliberately cause more instability.
And as is the norm these days, not much evidence or no evidence at all when it comes to US allegations against Iran. Jason Unruhe, political commentator, thank you very much indeed for joining us.